When you turn on your TV at night, you know that if you're going to watch a sci-fi movie like X-Men or The Avengers or Star Wars, that these movies contain no history and they do not portray anything that ever has or ever will happen. But if you watch House of Cards or Newsroom or West Wing, you know that though most of the main characters are fictitious, the storylines often deal with real historical events and people, and that these shows, though fundamentally a fictional account, may actually help you to understand the real nuances of actual events. And then if you turn on the news, most of you know that what you will see is a corporate sanitized version of the least relevant things that happened that day, used to keep you from knowing anything about what really happened that actually matters. Or maybe that's just me. No one could understand Star Wars if you thought you were watching a documentary or a news show. You have to understand the genre in order to be able to grasp the meaning of what you're watching. This is nowhere more true than when it comes to understanding the Bible. Those who insist upon reading the Bible literally, or who insist that every part of it is historical, will never understand what they're reading. The Gospels are not recording history. They're not even trying to be eyewitness accounts. No one that wrote any of the Gospels were alive at the time that these events took place. The Gospels are religious literature. In a very real way, they are sermons that were written to be heard in church. Bishop Spong says that we have to read them as if they are liturgy and not as history, or we will forever be deaf to their message. Today we're recounting the Passion narrative through the brilliant music of Jesus Christ Superstar, and I can only say a word of apology to our YouTube and iTunes audience because we can't legally reproduce that for you, but I wish you were here, and if you knew what we were doing, you would wish you were here too. But Jesus Christ Superstar is based on the Gospel of Matthew, which was, of course, based on the Gospel of Mark, which was, and here's the important point, only very loosely based on the events surrounding the death of Jesus. 50 years after Jesus was executed, Mark fleshed out the bare bones of the church's story in a dramatic narrative that is, we believe, set in the historical location, Jerusalem. It includes certain historical figures, Jesus, Pilate, Peter. The Gospels contain the names of some of the priestly figures of the period, though they play fast and loose with the details. They certainly all couldn't have been there at the same time. Mary Magdalene, no matter how well sung, may or may not have existed. What may surprise you is that biblical scholars generally agree that both Judas and Joseph of Arimathea and Barabbas are all literary creations. These are not literal people. They are created as literary characters to carry a part of the story. Paul, the first writer of the New Testament, mentions the execution of Jesus and the people around him, but he does not say that Jesus was betrayed by one of the 12. In fact, 20 years later, Paul still refers to the 12 as if they were all still alive. He never mentions Judas, and certainly not Judas's suicide. The name Judas is simply a Greek spelling of the Hebrew name Judah. Judas is then a literary character created to represent all of the Jewish people. His full name in the Gospels, Judas Iscariot, is even more symbolic since Iscariot means assassin. By the time Matthew is writing, the Jewish temple has been destroyed along with most of the Jews who lived in Palestine. The Christian religion is trying to put some distance at the end of the first century between itself and Judaism because while Christianity is spreading throughout the Roman Empire, they needed to put some distance between the Jews who had been an enemy of Rome and that Rome had been very disposed to wipe out. So they shift the blame from Rome to the Jews so that the literature they're writing would find acceptance within the Roman Empire. This was a tragic move because it set us up for centuries of anti-Semitism. But the attempt on the part of the gospel writers is to make Rome seem less guilty and the Jews to seem more guilty. But historically speaking, when the Jews wanted to execute someone, they stoned them. It wasn't a matter of needing Rome to do it. And the only people who crucified in those parts of the woods was Rome. So it was Rome that executed Jesus. And they didn't execute preachers for teaching about love and sharing, or for healing people, or performing miracles, or even for upsetting local religious leaders. Rome killed people who threatened the goals of the empire. If you threaten the trade, the economy, or the power of the empire, they killed you, and they killed you quickly. There is no doubt that Jesus and his followers were in tension with the Jewish Jerusalem priesthood because they were Galilean. Jerusalem priesthood didn't have much respect for the Jews that lived in the Galilee. So there's no doubt that there was a good deal of tension between them, but it didn't take the priests turning Jesus over to Rome for Jesus to end up on a cross. Pilate was not the sort to do the bidding of the priests. Actually, it was very much the other way around. Pilate and his officers actually controlled the vestments that the priests wore and only gave it to them when they wanted them to hold a religious ceremony. The government controlled the priesthood absolutely. Matthew, deeply imprinted by the Jewish scriptures, especially Psalm 22 and the suffering servant songs of Isaiah, edited Mark's version of the Passion to include multiple elements of Jewish heritage in Scripture that are typically invisible to our eyes, and even when you have them pointed out to you, they don't impress you very much. Though the Gospels are not concerned with the details of history, and in fact, they take some real liberties with the events to protect the early church from the ire of Rome, still, the Passion narrative is brilliant. Historically speaking, I don't know if Jesus expected to die when he took his movement to Jerusalem, but he certainly had to know that he was placing himself in grave danger. Just as every time Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr. knelt down in prayer to take a beating from the police or from the military, they didn't know if they were going to die that day or not. They didn't know if they would be killed by their government or by one of their critics or by one of their own people. Thomas Merton didn't know if his war protests during the early years in Vietnam would get him killed or if it would just make him reviled by conservative Catholics. Oscar Romero didn't know if he would survive any one of his imprisonments and beatings, nor did Dorothy Day. Romero was killed by an assassin trained in Fort Bennings, Georgia by the American military. Gandhi was killed by an assassin, as was King. Day managed to survive into her elder years and died naturally after suffering a lifetime of multiple imprisonments and abuse. Thomas Merton died in what was made to look like an accidental death in Tibet, though many at the time speculated that it was a CIA execution. I used to think that was silly, and in the last few years I've started to give that theory a lot more credibility. In the end, the story that Mark writes, the one that Matthew edits up, is a story about martyrdom. It's about being willing to pour out your life for a message of liberation, of love, of defiance of authority, and to compassionately give voice to the voiceless who suffer oppression. In that sense, the Jesus story is the story of Gandhi and King and Romero and Merton and a whole cloud of saints who were killed in the service of a greater good. And it is the story of a Dorothy Day and a Mother Teresa and countless others who were not murdered, but who gave their lives one day at a time in the pathway of radical compassion, placing their lives at risk and sacrificing any personal comfort as their reward. Like Jesus, each of these examples of faith were frequently betrayed by false friends, used by other people who pretended to be their friends, and they have all been exploited by insincere religious institutions. We divide up the parts each year when we do the music from Superstar My friend Paul sings the Jesus part. Sean sings Judas. Others are Mary, Herod, Pilate, Simon. But in the real world, we also play a part in the Passion narrative. We know all too well that we are not assigned parts. We choose parts. You can choose to betray a good friend. You can choose to side with power, the power of the state, the power of the marketplace, or even the power of the church. Or you can choose to live compassionately, which almost always means that you're also going to have to live sacrificially and to try to survive the betrayal and the corruption of both individuals and institutions. The Easter resurrection of Jesus is not, in my opinion, and nor in the consensus of biblical scholarship, a literal account of a man who was dead being brought back to life. The resurrection is a metaphor about courage, about determination, about faithfulness, the willingness to, even when you've been defeated, to try again, the choice to live for a reason, even if that reason will involve pain and sacrifice. In real life, we may not get just one role. We may have made some bad choices at several junctures of our life, but this is a story that invites us to choose again and to choose better next time. Free yourselves from the power of the state. Refuse to be imprisoned by the guilt of institutional religion. Do not be enslaved to a desire for money or security. Live large. Love generously. Forgive without limits. Do not be defeated by false friends or divorce or cancer or bankruptcy. Be renewed in the resurrection of your own life by your own choice. Christ is risen, but Christ is only risen in you.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Rev. Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.